Hello, good evening from South Africa. For those of you who are in this country, excuse my lighting, we are having load shedding. For those of you who don't know, it's when electricity goes down. So we are on lights and backups, but we should all be good for this session. Welcome to a session on compliance, SOPs, and quality management systems. I'm really proud that this webinar series is brought to you by Cannavigia, who are based in Switzerland. They are European pioneers for compliance software. They're doing some incredible things. They have an amazing user interface. They have lots of content, so check them out online. And at the moment, they have 5,331,475 plants that are being tracked on their platform across the planet, which is really exciting. So thank you for them. They're sponsoring this whole series. I'd like to thank SANCAP as well, the Southern African Network of Cannabis Professionals, which is an organization set up to bring people together from the sort of cultivation industry, as well as Indoor Sun, who are a local lighting company, and Cannabis Africa for participating in this. So wherever you're coming from, the people who are in this particular room and those who are watching on LinkedIn, thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to unpack this sort of topic in much more detail. We'll be taking some questions at the end. Compliance can be a big mountain to climb. And we have some very experienced people who are going to unpack and help educate us, me included, because it goes deep. And then we'll unpack sort of some questions towards the end. But before we get there, I'm going to bring in a very good friend of ours, Jeff Verlinden. So Jeff, if you'd like to join us, and we're going to start off by myth busting and unpacking some of the terminology in sort of compliance. So if we could just start, I know Jeff is with Separations, which is an extraction company. He's a biochemist. He also runs a channel called South African Cannabis Extraction on YouTube, which is an amazing channel. So has been sort of in the industry for many years and has a lot of deep experience. And obviously with his pharmaceutical background, really understands the technicalities of compliance. So Jeff, how are you doing?
Good, awesome. Thanks for having me on. Awesome to discuss this. You know, we try to simplify and unpack compliance, and we can get very technical. So feel free, the audience, to ask questions, points of clarification. We can go into those verticals.
Yeah, I think what we need to sort of take out from this is compliance is tough, but compliance is also your friend. You know, and it's very important for traceability, trackability, etc. So it's a necessary thing that we have to embrace in the industry. And I think that's going to be a great opportunity to unpack some of the ins and outs of that. So let's start off by, QMS, Quality Management System. What's a quick definition of exactly what a quality management system is when it comes to commercial cannabis cultivation?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we can step back even from just focusing on cannabis. Essentially, it's about operating principles for business to produce generally a repeatable product or outcome, whether that's a service or product. You know, so for me, it's one about defining things like SOPs. In the medical space, you're going to have things like GMP, SOPs, all these acronyms that come up, and ICH guidelines like Q10 you need to adhere to for pharmaceutical. Ultimately, it's about systemizing the business. It's about understanding what are the parameters that are critical to the process that impacts the quality of that manufacturing. In the case of commercial cannabis, you know, what's going to impact the growth, the repeatability, the contamination, if there is any or not. You know, what is going to affect the water? All these things have an impact, and therefore you start to outline all the critical parameters that ultimately affect the business and its operations.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's it can be quite daunting. But I think it's how do you eat an elephant? You know, break it all into bite-sized chunks. So, what is an SOP? A standard operating procedure document? Just describe.
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to think about it is if I ask you to make coffee. It's a very direct and peaceful request to me. But the reality is we make coffee differently. How much water are you going to put in the cup? How much milk? Are you going to add sugar? Are you going to add no sugar? You know, simple. So in that sense, like with coffee, it's like, okay, switch on the kettle is the first instruction. But if the kettle's empty, there's no water in there, then it should be fill the kettle to this level, then power it on. If it doesn't power on, was it plugged in? You know, so these are the kind of nuances you start to develop with SOPs. Is the best way to explain writing of SOPs is you should actually grab someone from accounting or HR and then give them this SOP and say, please execute the tasks listed in this document, step for step. And if they start, they're like, okay, well, it says I must do this, but where's the scissor? I don't know. Then it's like, oh, well, we didn't really think about how to word this SOP like an instruction manual so that you can follow every single step. And we've all seen it. You know, you get some instruction manuals that are like, okay, wait, I didn't understand. Where is that? And then you kind of sometimes find gaps in those manuals. It's the same concept with the SOP. And for every critical process in your manufacturing, you need to have the respective SOP that needs to obviously be approved by someone. It can't be changed unless it's authorized and a new revision is signed into effect.
Yeah, and I think the whole point of it is to make sure there's consistency. Because essentially, you know, we are talking about commercial cannabis cultivation, in this instance, to a large degree, medical cannabis cultivation. So consistency is absolutely key. And, you know, down to, as you say, you know, where the coffee spoons are or where you keep the sugar. Those things are you know, those minute details, as much as they can seem onerous and frustrating, make up the whole sort of procedural process that essentially a plant factory operates on. Cool. Let's just unpack what a site master file is.
Good. So we have Gustav on today as well, who's going to really give us a lot of detail, but essentially it outlines the operations of a pharmaceutical site. So in the site master file, you should have obviously the location, the operations, and a real guideline about what's happening specifically on the site. Obviously, beyond the site master file, that's where you need to have your quality assurance department start to furnish all the respective QMS documents and SOPs that make up the batch operations throughout that facility. So the site master file is kind of like an overview document about what specifically will happen on the site, who's responsible, the organogram involved in the process. So it outlines just a synopsis of what should happen at that site and what products you will be manufacturing and those kind of details.
Yeah, well, I want to unpack later on what the exact roles are and who does what on site. So let's go through a few other things that come up quite often. GMP, good manufacturing practice.
Yes, also known as good get more paper. Essentially, it aligns with those SOPs. It's that concept of when it comes to medicine specifically, the primary objective here is safety, and then obviously efficacy for the product and all the rest. But generally, what happened in the past and what drove the FDA, so the Federal Drug Administration in the US, to really focus heavily on GMP in the early stage of its development was people were getting poisoned. Something was incorrectly being brought into a facility, being compounded into that product got to patients. So inadvertently, several people die, and therefore there's a critical finding. So the idea here is to be able to take things like a dossier for a product, follow the instructions about how to manufacture it. In the case of cannabis, you know, specifically, what am I doing for cultivation? If I'm doing an extraction of that cannabis, what are the steps I'm taking? How am I cleaning up that product? How are we going to be testing that product so we can ultimately release that product? Additionally, you'll be looking at other COA requirements, things like stability on those products. But the idea of good manufacturing practices or manufacturing is to get to a point where you reproducibly always produce the same product with minimal deviation, and it always tests through compliantly.
Yeah. And then the difference between sort of EU GMP and GMP. So, I mean, what is the...
Yeah, so, I mean, theoretically, so South Africa is a member of PICS, which is the Pharmaceutical International Cooperation Scheme. There are 54 members. South Africa is the only African member of that. Generally, we should be harmonized to ICH guidelines, which is the International Harmonization Commission. So basically, the intention there is that when we provide a drug product to another country, we should be enforcing and maintaining our auditors. So SAHPRA, in this case, the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, should be auditing all drug manufacturing or medicine manufacturing in the country to the same interpretative standards as what the FDA, the European Pharmacopoeia, and others would as well. So most of this refers to the ICH guidelines and standards for GMP, which is readily available on the internet if you search for it. But the intention of EU GMP is generally any product received into the EU needs to obviously go through that process of being inspected to the same level. So, you know, it depends on the extent to which certain European countries would accept your regulator's interpretation. It should be the same, but often certain countries then would go to that added step of inspecting themselves and validating, doing a site audit, specifically confirming that that site is producing to the standards required for their patient. Because it's ultimately their legal responsibility if something goes wrong.
Yeah. Okay, just two more definitions. GACP, good agricultural practices.
Yeah, good agricultural
collection practices.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so GAP is good agricultural practices. GACP is good agricultural collection practices. There's a lot of guidelines. I mean, this has been around. Botanicals has been used in medicine for a very long time. It's not novel. There is obviously a strong push towards single drug molecules, synthetically produced, because it just reduces variability. So that's popular within pharmaceutical manufacturing. But GACP is in place, and groups like the WHO, World Health Organization, has outlined standards. EuroPAM has got a good working group. The American Herbal Society has got So there's all these groups that specifically outline how to harvest or cultivate certain botanicals, how to harvest them, how to dry them, how to prepare them so they can be used or compounded into a further drug manufacturing pipeline or into additional steps. It doesn't necessarily have to be for pharmaceutical applications, but in the context here, we're referring to GACP, often for the intended purposes of cultivating cannabis and drying cannabis for final sale.
Yeah, great. And finally, ISO.
Yeah, the International Organization of Standards or Standards Organization. Yeah, it's pretty much like any business. If you had ISO 9001, you'd be familiar already with ISO. It's about just standardizing the operations of a business, from your procedures, your policies, your HR, your hiring, firing, onboarding. All of this is generally systematized. And I think this kind of ties to the whole QMS concept, because if you look at a pilot has got a checklist of everything that needs to be done before the flight takes off. If you look at good surgeons, most good surgeons will have a list that has to go through the trauma units in terms of we need to make sure all this is ready, checked, so that we can be effective in performing this critical life-saving operation. It's that same concept with ISO is you want to have these standards and you get all these sub-standards. So ISO 17025 specifically focuses on lab accreditation. Are the labs accredited? Do they follow the same methods? Are they validated for precision, accuracy, limits of detection are assessed? So you got all these different ISOs based on, these different subclasses under the organization.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jeff. And before those who are not that familiar with these terminologies get overwhelmed, don't worry. We're going to unpack things as we go along. There's a comment here from Chris Bud. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I said, we are EQMS that handles GMP requirements. Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. So let's bring in the rest of our guests. If we can bring in Wesley, Gustav, and if we can bring in Donna as well. Hello, everybody. Can you just take that off the screen? Thank you. Hello, guys. How are you doing? So, let's just start with a quick introduction. So I'll move around the screen. Maria Ndaba from Druids Garden. Hello, how are you doing? If you could just tell us who you are and a bit about Druids. Maria, we've lost you there for a sec. Maria, we'll come back to you. You were perfect during the check, so we'll come back to you in a second. Gustav, hello. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Trenton. Thank you for having me, and thank you to all the people that's listening in. I've been involved in the medicinal cannabis industry for my sins for the last 5 years, primarily in Lesotho. But I've had the privilege of dealing with fairly large organizations and had to school myself with very quickly with the concepts that we will be discussing tonight, especially since it was guided by European standards. So I'm looking forward to having this discussion and see how I can contribute. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Gustav. I know you've been on commercial farms for many years and also a cultivator for many years, and so thank you for being here. Maria, are you back?
Yes, I'm back.
Yes, you are. Great, thank you. If you could just introduce yourself and tell us where you're from.
All right, I'm Maria Ndaba. I'm from around the area, grew up in Lanseria. I'm currently with Druids Garden as the quality control manager and just making sure that everything goes according to our SOPs.
AKA whip cracker.
Yeah.
And then Wesley, we can see where you're from, Cannavigia.
Yeah.
I wanted to just mention earlier that Cannavigia sort of cover the whole supply chain, all the way from seed to sale. I know you recently released software for dispensaries as well. So you're based in Johannesburg. Just quickly introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Trenton. Great to see everyone here. I am Wesley. I'm, as I said, mentioned, based here in Johannesburg. I'm the business development manager for the Africa side of Cannavigia. But my background on that is I come from the agricultural space and also been involved in the cannabis industry for a couple of years now. And navigating the QMS world like everyone else in the cannabis space very slowly. I can agree with Gustav. It's Jeff, we are envious of you, of all your insight into those details, but we navigated it. It's a team effort because it is a complicated field.
It is, and that's why we've got experts, to help us with these things. I think one of the things, as South Africans and Africans, we're often, used to doing a multitude of things. It's very different to Europe, where you do, you specialize. And I think we have that kind of mentality that we can do all kinds of things. But as we're learning about the complexities of commercial cannabis cultivation, we're realizing that we do need specialists for each section within these operations. Maria, let's start with you. You're on the ground every day, box ticking, checking things are done. Can you just unpack and describe some of the types of standard operating procedures that you have to enforce? And then also just maybe unpack some of the challenges you have in terms of which ones are the toughest to make happen.
All right, being on the ground, I have to make sure that all the SOPs are followed correctly. And in order to do that, we use the SOPs to help us, to guide us doing everything step by step. So I do the daily checks, so to make sure that we track and trace everything by using Cannavigia also. So when using my supporting documents, we start from the seedlings or from the cuttings. We have to register that, what strain it is, what date it was planted, and also not only that, make sure that all our tunnels are clean and that all our staff are following the procedures, correct PPE, because one mistake, we are doomed for sure. So we have to be correct in everything we do. Hygiene is number one. And also to communicate with my head grower. So as I do my daily checks, anything I suspect that is incorrect, our pest and diseases or anything else, I need to report to him immediately so that he can implement the correct IPM for spraying the tunnels according to what was found.
And what are some of the key areas that you find you struggle with people? Because what we also have to remember here is that we're dealing with a multiple layers of staffing. We're dealing with sort of your lower level, for want of a better word, laborers who might not, be that, especially in this country, might not be that lingual in terms of documentation, and then you go all the way up. So how do you? Where are some of the key challenges you have in terms of your different levels of personnel, and are there any specific things that really drive you mad that are not done when they're supposed to be done?
Well, my biggest challenge at the moment, so far, it's our growers. We all know we are used to growing this cannabis behind our gardens, so they're not used to following procedures. The simple thing is wearing your gloves. I struggle with that. I have to keep on reminding them, because when we do our test, anything that what you touch with your dirty hands, you don't know what you've been up to. So that at the end of the day comes out in the lab results, and then mostly then our staff gets blamed, which is totally not the case. I make sure that the staff is fully in PPE. So my biggest challenge is the growers.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're gonna get into the growers in a minute. But actually, it's funny you say that, because a few months ago I was at a farm, and the guys had their flour tested, and they picked up feces in the flour. And when they actually started to investigate, they realized that the guys hadn't been washing their hands, they'd been to the toilet, and these are, when we're talking about medicine, for this is quite serious. So thanks for that, Maria. Gustav, you are a cultivator who sort of, come into a legal framework, and I want to unpack the whole sort of cultivation or cultivator challenge in terms of growers' ego, etc. later. But can we unpack a bit more about sort of the QMS and how you manage QMS on site? What's your approach to that?
Thanks, Trenton. Yeah, Maria, I have to agree that that cultivation and QM traditionally do not have a very good track record of walking out of a boardroom happy. But I think if people can embrace the fact that this is here for a reason. QM is not there, and quality assurance is not there to make your life difficult. It is there to make sure that your risk management and your quality management system stands up to scrutiny in terms of your product quality going out. So it's a question of you benchmarking me, and I give feedback back to quality assurance about things that needs to change. As I always say, an SOP is a living document, and if it needs to change, you review it, like Jeff mentioned, and you adopt that as your effective version. That becomes your training version. So you'll have an effective SOP, you'll have a training SOP, which will be the most current one. If I need to change stuff, guess what? I need to rewrite my training SOP and give my training according to the new adopted SOP. So I think also, if I can just step back, your question, how do we manage a site in accordance with your site master file? It starts by the core team getting together, which should include the cultivator or head of cultivation or the cultivation team from the outset, even as early as Wesley will, I think, attest, adopting your C2 cell software, because everything flows from there. And if you are a week away from bringing your first cuttings into production, and you're now suddenly scrambling to get your SOP sorted, it's not going to be conducive. There is a learning curve regardless of what software you use for your C2 cell program. So the earlier you start adopting that software, understanding it, uploading and the ability to upload your inputs. I always say that your inputs equals your outputs. It's just that way. What you put in, you're going to get out. If you put in inorganic material and you treat it not in the correct organic matter, that will reflect in, as Maria said, in your final COAs. Unfortunately, that is too late, because then at that point, if the COA is out, the plants are in packaged, ready for distribution, and it comes back, it's contaminated with nickel, for example, where it's above the EU pharmacopoeia's tolerance for sulfur, etc., microbiologies. So it's super important that parameters gets built in, and that we learn to use those inputs, and then also obviously we'll be able to data mine from that and improve our QMS as we go along. So that's basically how we tackle it. We start from the site master file, we look at it at a holistic manner, and that means every facet from it, from your site plan right to your description of your HVAC system, your water reticulation and recapturing, which is super important, especially if you're in an environmental sensitive environment. With farmlands around you, there might be some form of informal settlement or whatever around you. So that's all the kind of things that you need to take in consideration when you design your site master file. And that obviously also, as Jeff will attest, is something that you have to submit together with your application to SAFRA. So you fill in your application, and you submit your site master file, and then every aspect in the site master file will cross-reference back to your SOPs, of which you then at that point in time during your first or during your inspection should have at hand, should the inspectors want to drill down further in, for example, your hygiene, like Maria said, that is super important. So that's a sort of in a nutshell, Trenton, on how we go about this.
And in terms of your sort of pet peeves, like what are some of the things that you find are a struggle for you in terms of SOPs being followed?
Again, I think Maria touched on it, and that is the transitioning from legacy to medicinal. I don't particularly like the distinction. I know I always say the plant does not know if it's an adult use plant or a medicinal plant. It's the same plant. We put that label on them, but we roll with the punches. So it's the transitioning of learning to keep a grower's diary, learning to cloak up, learning when and how and where can you use curative measurements. How can you integrate IPM in your daily use? And this is true if you're growing under a grow tent, a 2x4, or you've got a 500 square meter indoor. The complexity gets more intense in terms of, for example, your HVAC design. If you grow indoor, you'll have a much more complex system as if you're growing broadacre for extraction, for example. So that's not a big P. It's just something that I noticed that happens a lot of time, is that there's this transition. And I think the big P probably would be all the paperwork. but luckily Cannavigia and it makes this much less hard work, and you don't have to spend so much time behind the computer shuffling paper, which is part and parcel of what cultivation does. The days where you walk into your tent or your grow room and you look at your flowers, those days are over when you walk into a medicinal facility. And paperwork and SOPs becomes first nature to you after a while.
Yeah, I think this is a common theme I'm finding in the South African industry. Certainly, I've had conversations with internationals that it's a similar thing, in the sense that this crossover from being a home grower cultivator to an illicit cultivator, moving into a sort of highly regulated, structured environment is very tough for some. I've spoken to many high cultivators that say, you spend 60-70% of your time behind a computer. So it's not for everybody, that people have this idea that it's glamorous to be a head cultivator. And while it's certainly it is an amazing job, there's a certain mentality that comes with that. And I think that looseness that comes with kind of home growing and not for everybody, but moving into something more, I guess corporate, more structured is not always successful for everybody. I think it's also important to understand that from a compliance perspective, we have two different areas essentially within a cultivation space. We have the growing of the plant, so the cultivation side, and we also have the processing side. So the compliance literally goes across both of those spaces. Wesley, let's just discuss some compliance roles. So you spend a lot of time on farms. You spend a lot of time engaging with people at multiple levels. Can you just give us a bit of insight into the kind of roles that people play within the space and who exactly does what?
So there's a lot that's come through in this space, and a lot's changed. And I like what you guys were just talking about on the previous point here of head cultivator. The roles have changed a lot more. And one of the biggest things that I can pull out is we're finding this distinguishing factor between cultivation manager and head cultivators. The head cultivators will still be in the production side actually cultivating, but your cultivation manager has to have that understanding of cultivation, being able to manage cultivators, much like Maria has to manage to make sure her cultivators are wearing gloves, everything else, but also understanding the flow of everything else that goes into cultivation. Inventory management, process flows, planning batches. That is that, as you say, 70-80% of the time that you're sitting behind the computer. One of the things that we don't have in South Africa is the luxury of enough skilled people to fill those different roles. So in a lot of the cultivation space within the South African context or African context, is we find a lot of people filling multiple roles at the same time. So more established businesses have a nice hierarchy of who's in charge, so you'll have multiple people in the cultivation stage, which is something really nice. And I think that's something that we need to work towards. But having those different layers of who is doing what, who is doing maintenance. We start from the ground up, as you said. You'll have people working on the laboring side. Well, if you're working on the laboring side as manual labor and that, you still have a lot that you're subject to on what your impact on the plant is. You still have SOPs to follow. You still have a lot of compliance levels you have to gauge. Moving up into general people working on plants that maybe fall under your cultivators. Head cultivators might be per room, might be per tunnel, might be per project. The context, and I say, there's a lot of, every company has a different role to do it. I've been able to see companies that have a lot of staff that cover every role, and I've had small companies that we work in the South African space where it's 3 or 4 people that are doing everything. These roles jump, and I think Gustav can agree to that, is you have to play this multifaceted role, and then you start disliking the QMS side of things, because it does become laborious. It does become a bit of an enemy of, if you're trying to do everything else and you still have to go back and fill this out. That's something where we came in with the compliance software. It's not your complete solution to compliance for your facility. It is just a aspect. It is the aspect to try to cut down as much paperwork as possible, to try to free up as much time. And that's something that is moving forward, but that's not something that's just specifically cannabis. That's within the realm of digital agriculture, is trying to speed up that agricultural process. We're subject to a lot of the same things that your high-grade fruit exporters have. And these guys run their businesses like an absolute machine. You have cultivators that I think have never set foot in some of these orchards because these guys run sitting in front of 10 screens, watching environmentals, weather incoming, as well as QMS going out. The cannabis space is getting there. We're all just figuring this out as we go, and it is complicated. And I think that's why we can maybe get a bit of a kickback and a little bit of fight back from the cultivator side of going, this is targeted. This is, why do we have to hit to these compliance levels? And I think that point's getting missed a bit sometimes.
Well, it's kind of nature and science combined, you know, and, you know, there are your purists who just want to be with the plants, and trying to marry those two kind of personalities essentially doesn't often work so well. What is your opinion on owners of farms, investors, maybe investors that are sort of more hands-on involved, and how important it is for them to understand compliance? Because there's often this disconnect between the grower and the investor, or the owner, manager of the farm. How important do you think that is?
So I want to take it back and go to an even larger, a bit more macro view of it. And you showed that slide in the beginning of the integrated network. I don't know if we can pull it up again for a quick view.
Pull it up, yeah, absolutely.
So the idea behind having compliance standards, SOPs, QMS, as everyone's mentioned, is to standardize processes. If we can standardize these processes, it means we can have more people plug in and understand. That is actually the key role of what standardization is for. It's repetitive, as Jeff mentioned. It is to hit the same goal each and every time that you can reproduce the same results and consistently do it with minimal deviation. As soon as we can do that, it is a lot easier to explain to people outside of the immediate cultivation facility, whether that is an owner that is on site or an owner that is overseas. But take it even a step back. Well, how do we get past this? Is to try standardize the information to get a bank involved. We want to, if you're going to have this network, it needs to be enabled completely. The only way to do that is to match up as many standardized features that other industries recognize to participate and come in, go, oh, wait, we're actually familiar with ISO. We're actually familiar with GMP. That is where these come in. And having owners that can understand compliance software to level it down is give them the information they need.
Yeah.
An investor or an owner doesn't want to see the day-to-day, every single detail that goes in. Someone in quality management like Maria, she needs to know that. An investor needs to know that she signed off on it. That is the traceability section of, you had a responsible person on site that is signed off on this process. And that's the same corporate structure that you go in anywhere, is you have to narrow down that information, make it readable to the next person that is easily understandable, and you can sign it off and move it into the next stage. Because at the end of the day, people in charge of facilities, they're not looking at a medicinal plant, they're looking at financial, they're looking at bottom line. That's the information that's important to them. If you go, we accidentally didn't wash our hands and we ruined an entire batch and now we have to take a giant loss, that's something that they do not want to know, but it's something that they understand because it's a financial implication.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example of the disconnect sometimes between cultivators and between management, and trying to find that middle ground is, these are the challenges of any sunrise industry, I guess. Thanks for that. Jeff, let's talk about, where the kind of source of all these, SOPs, QMS, like, we sometimes talk in South Africa about, EU GMP standards being, too high for the South African markets. We do need standardization, but ultimately, who sets those? So from a South African perspective, we're obviously following a lot of international standards. If you want to export to Australia, you want to export to Europe, they have certain protocols that need to be followed. But where do we draw the line between creating our own sort of standard operating procedures, for our environment, which is very different to other countries? How do we sort of approach that from a scientific and administrative perspective?
Yeah, look, it's a challenging one because the reality is you need a regulator that's willing to take an independent position, especially if you look at the Canadians. They took on an independent position for quite a few things in cannabis. The Israelis as well and the Canadians, they all take a view on it and they hold that view. One of the advantages here is our sunlight, but often that is not an advantage in a highly regulated, hermetically sealed environment when you're trying to export to Europe. So this is where you need to understand increasingly, yes, we are bound by our off-takes, so who's buying the product, being primarily focused outside of the country, which is a challenge because how do you produce a world-class product when you have no domestic time to cultivate and build expertise, selling domestically first, and then entering a global stage? I mean, most businesses would typically take that route to market where they excel within their domestic market, they monopolize or do really well in that market, and then start to go for more ambitious targets abroad. Here, what we're doing is we're kind of immediately tackling the challenge of providing to some of the most highly regulated markets in the world without even having access really to a domestic market. There's access through Section 21, which is personal, specialized unregistered medicine. But really, it's not the mainstream access we really need to build that institutional memory when it comes to business operations, quality. I mean, we talked a lot about the boardroom fights between QA and the guys on the ground. But I mean, the biggest benefit of compliance is the ability to identify mistakes quickly and to rectify them and implement efficiencies. So, you can tell, and this is one of the biggest benefits overall about compliance is immediately you can know something's wrong and prevent it. And you can also identify losses and efficiencies very early and correct for it. And I mean, that's really what any business owner, investor wants, is that highly efficient, highly systematized business. Because when you go to McDonald's, you always get the same product. And that's because of that investment in repeatable manufacturing. And the problem I just have is that there's no mutually recognized agreements for cannabis. There's no GMP consensus on the standards for cannabis due to federal legality. So it makes it very difficult and it makes it very interpretive around medicinal cannabis standards. And that's kind of weird because the pharmaceutical industry is normally not very interpretive. They're not very open to interpretation. This is the set of guidelines. Here's the monograph for this product. We still don't have a regulator who's issued a monograph per se, specifically for the quality considerations of cannabis in South Africa. And that's a challenge because now we're starting to get into this very interpretive space in what should be a very standardized product.
Yeah, and essentially, just to clarify, SAHPRA are the sort of regulators for medicinal cannabis. They regulate medicines across the board. And there's all kinds of conversations about ASTM, which is an American organization, and drawing on some standards from them. We've got to remember that we're in a sunrise industry and we're all figuring this out as we go along. Yes, the Americans have been at it for a long time, but that's one market. And, there are very different sort of climatic conditions in the north to the south, even between, Europe and America, the many differences. So I think it's important that we accept that and understand that. But ultimately, the key drivers for me are, consistency and also protecting the consumer. Cool. Just a reminder, this is part of a series of webinars we are doing with Cannavigia. So we've got a few more coming up. You'll see on the screen here. For those of you who have registered for this, we will inform you as they come up, and we'll be unpacking all kinds of different things in the industry. At the end of the day, what's super important to move this industry forward is that we share knowledge. That is, I think, one of the biggest challenges we have. Sadly, in South Africa, we're not very good at sharing knowledge. We're not very good at collaborating and working together. And so that's what these platforms are for. Maria, let's just look at the day when you start. How do you deal with, do you brief your staff on the morning? How do you discipline staff when they're not following SOPs? Do you find different levels are more compliant than others? What are some of the day-to-day sort of procedures and challenges that you face?
On ground, every Monday our cultivation team has a meeting, but the most difficulties at the moment is lack of planning. I think if we plan proper, then we won't run into troubles of not following our SOPs. Now, this is why a quality control manager is important on site. Our growers mustn't see us as a threat and see the SOPs as a must to do things compliant. See our SOPs as guidelines and use us, the quality control managers on site, to help you improve things as we report to you guys on a daily basis. And that's about it. It's just we need to plan things proper. That's the most difficulty I come across.
I guess another thing that's important, because to some degree there's standardization, across multiple farms, but every farm has its own nuances, its own structure, so different ways of cultivating. Describe your onboarding process for new staff. How does that work?
Well, we train our staff. The grower trains our staff as to what needs to be done. So we start from our cuttings. They'll show them or what needs to be done, and I need to record that in our SGPs And with the help of the Cannavigia, it makes things simple because I can just scan and input my recommendations on there, and then we take it from there.
Great, thanks. So we've got a question from Michael in the Western Cape. I'm assuming it's from a farm, saying, how do you visualize or ensure that SOPs are at the forefront of people in terms of them remembering? Do you have them on the walls? Do you have them on clipboards? Do you email them to them? Maybe that's for anybody to answer. Like, how do you actually reinforce those on a day-to-day basis on site physically? Anyone want to answer that?
I'll take. I think it's so important to see who is the bulk of your employment force. And let's take my experience from Lesotho, where you have got magnificent growers that's got a natural talent and a love and a feeling for the plant. They've been doing it for yonkers. All that now needs to happen is there needs to be a crossover in how do I explain and how do I give them the tools to understand what I'm trying to say. And if you start by saying the reason why this is an important SOP to follow is because that is the outcome. It's cause and effect. If I neglect a certain part of my SOPs, the output will be different. So again, it talks to that stability. But in terms of employment, I think it's crucial. You can work with key cards. You can do instructional videos. A picture paints 1,000 words. If you want, take a link. If there's a fantastic guy that you're following on YouTube that just sort of encapsulates the way you take cuttings or the way you do this, take that link. Nothing prevents you. Bump that into your SOP. There's a link. Go and look at this is what we're trying to do. Give some references. Your SOP allows for that. Put your references in there. And make that part of your education process. Get your guys together. We see it works. Get them together. Show them a video of a large-scale facility. Because things that come naturally to us, for a lot of these people, it's completely foreign concepts. They know when to look at a plant and when it's an unhealthy plant, but you need to bring the reasoning and the science behind it. And this is the way the SOPs help to guide you towards what kind of education or skills, rather, would you require from your different department heads right down to your backend?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Great.
Trenton, can I jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it, Wes.
So there's a few things, and I'll say from the point of the Cannavigia side of things is we've taken it quite nicely to have a few different features to actually help on something like this. Something like our mobile apps, and you'll see this when we set up and I run you through like the heavy details, is loading a piece of equipment on the system is you can access that piece of equipment by scanning a QR code standing next to it. And on that piece of equipment, you have a copy of the manual and an SOP for it. So if you ever need to, you have those copies available. Having tasks within the system has an SOP loaded against it. Those things are really important. As you say, fragment them out. Don't have a huge SOP. Don't give someone a whole document and say, here's your SOPs in a giant file. Fragment them down into the little bits that you need, cleaning, sweeping. And that's something that we've done in the system, is to break it down into as many little pieces as possible, because it makes it a lot easier for the average person to understand. If you need to write your tasks in multiple ways, you have them in different languages, you can do that on the system. And another very key aspect, and Gustav was mentioning that, and it's a little part of the feature that we added into the system. It's a tiny little feature that I love to bits, and it's the training guide. It doesn't really do anything except document trainings. And you can see who's attended training, who's up to date, who needs to have it. Because let's face it, part of your site master file and everything that goes into this is if someone comes to audit you at the end of the day and they go to any one of your staff and they ask them what they should know and they do not, you have a problem. It is your responsibility to make sure that everyone that is exposed to the production side is trained in their relative areas regularly. If you update SOPs, you update versions, you need to update your training. And I think that's something that you can't stress enough, is a constant training. And I like what Gustav is saying, is change up your training. How do you do it? Find people that are relevant. Find things that work for your facility. Find different ways, because it is on you to make sure that when everyone leaves that training, they understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. Wes, we've got another question from Tebogo in the Northern Cape, which is relevant to you actually. Just he wants an idea of kind of, you know, what, and I don't expect you to give an exact figure because obviously it varies, but what are the kind of cost implications of a system like Cannavigia, and how long on average, and I guess it depends on the size of the grow, etc., but how long does it normally take to integrate a system into a cannabis farm?
So the cost will vary based on, okay, I'll talk generally from different softwares as a whole. There's various different models. Some will have a fixed price on a large scale. We have a standard pricing for just the different modules, depending on what you need, if it's just cultivation, and then how many users you want. So you still have access to the full system. If you want a very integrated facility with all of your users on mobile apps and everything else, obviously costs are going to rise quite steeply because of that. Some other people have models based on cultivation size, which doesn't really work in South Africa because space isn't limited. So it is down to your individual operation of how many people do you need to access the system. Are you having a single point in your facility where one person oversees the entire system, which some people do, and it worked perfectly for them because there's no one way to do this. Then as far as the integration goes, that purely depends on the type of facility. As Gustav mentioned, is if you adopt a system from day one, when you put out your site master plan and you do your proposal, that integration is really, really quick because it's while you're doing everything else. If you're trying to integrate a system where you already have existing SOPs and processes running, that makes it incredibly difficult because you're trying to run parallel systems while moving over. And trust me, I've seen it. That's where mistakes happen. So something like that, I'd recommend, instead of saying taking 3 to 4 weeks during different trainings and different onboardings, we've had people do an entire system onboarding in less than 2 weeks. And we've had people that are running over 3 to 4 months.
Yeah, so very broad. But I mean, can you give us any? I mean, I appreciate I'm not putting you on the spot here, but any indication of like a monthly cost or an annual cost on, you know, let's say a simple setup or simple in inverted commas with you know, sort of a processing facility and let's say 2 greenhouses, a rough kind of estimate of what that would cost somebody.
So something like that, you will be looking in the region of about $7,000 to $10,000 for the year.
Okay. So
now break that down. It is pricey and it does come off as very expensive, but remember the role of what this is supposed to do is actually cut down on the amount of time you spend on stuff. A good compliance software, it's not everything about your facility, it's just a large portion of it, is that should be able to reliably replace a staff member if you were to hire someone full-time just to do all the paperwork, or 2 people. So the cost value, you look at what does this save me, and what value does it generate in terms of speeding up my production and the value it adds in terms of data tracking, long-term farming
risk mitigation as well is also a massive component.
So
you know,
you have to balance up those costs for small companies, and that's one thing we're trying to do. And we're always trying to look at how best we can help is emerging markets and small facilities. Look, for a small facility, that is a big chunk of their budget. For large facilities, on the other hand, that's almost nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Great, thanks for that. Gustav, I'm going to ask this question to you as a cultivator. What would your advice be to cultivators who are growing in the illicit market or home cultivators who want to move into the space in terms of, you know, leaving their ego at the door? Let's just call a spade a spade. What would your advice be to people looking to become, you know, sort of cultivators on big farms?
Trenton, yeah, I think it goes without saying that you should have a passion for the plant, but you should be multidisciplinary as well, as you mentioned. And the days you need, unfortunately, to take that jacket off and put it in the closet and take it out when you go to your own personal farm. But you need to put on your dust coat and your gloves, and you need to change your mindset on how you're growing, and you need to understand how absolutely valuable your input is on every aspect of this grow. And a lot of people make the mistake of only onboarding the cultivation team and identifying genetics at a very late stage, where it's so much easier if you employ your cultivator or your head of cultivation from the outset, like I said, because they can be crucial in saving the investors a ton of money. But the transition takes time. There's this thing about competition and the old school way of sharing information and phoning your mate. Here's a picture of my plant. What kind of deficiency does it have, etc., etc. That's how we learn. We learned by exchanging ideas, and I think that's also where Cheeba will play a vital role going forward in bringing and breaking down this reason why not share knowledge. Somebody once said, you can watch this many Tiger Woods videos of instructional, you'll never be able to hit the ball like him. Yeah. So your recipe is not secret, it's not special, your genetic might be, but at the end of the day, we can't grow as an industry if we don't learn from each other, and especially our mistakes. Let's celebrate our victories, but also be able to claim our failures and saying, I made a mistake here, because I'll rather help somebody prevent that QA disqualifies a total batch because of an oversight ABC. And if you're running 2 or 3 grow tents or 5 rooms, but suddenly when you're working at scale and you lose a batch that's consisting out of maybe even 2,000 plants, that is a chunk of cash that you're leaving on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people don't understand the amount of money that is invested into these facilities. And when you're looking at a tunnel or an indoor room full of cannabis, there's a lot of value in that space. Jeff, this is probably a question for you. It's from Maria in Portugal. She says, when it comes to compliance on the processing side, there are some basic principles that are needed, in the actual processing facility. So I'm interpreting that as, things like using medical grade plastic, ensuring that there are no sort of corners where you can sort of end up with pathogens, negative pressures. Could you maybe just unpack some of that from a farmer perspective?
Sure. When it comes to, processing, we really got to consider the inputs and the outputs, like we've mentioned in the past. When you receive materials into that facility, you quarantine those materials. You make sure there's a certificate of analysis, you do any raw material testing required, and then you allow that product into your facility for storing and use in that facility. Same with your personnel. Your personnel needs to be appropriately gowned into that area. Why? Because all those areas are sanitized, ready for operation, maintained in that state. The air and the water coming into that facility is regulated by the heating, ventilation, air conditioning, the HVAC, or the reverse osmosis system for the water. So we're really trying to create a very highly controlled environment, because if you're, for instance, drying cannabis in that environment, that's when moisture is still present and microbial growth can still happen. And we know that personnel is always, I often deal with sterile applications. Personnel is the number one risk to a process in manufacturing. We have more microorganisms on our body than actually number of cell counts. Our cells are just much bigger. So we are living with this, which means you can't be having your cell phone on. You can't be going to the bathroom back and forth the whole time. You need to hire people that have a good bladder and don't have a cigarette addiction, because they need to work for 4 hours in processing, go for lunch, and work the remaining 4 hours, and not constantly gone in and out. There's all these considerations about, the processing is somewhat different from the cultivation at times, depending on how you set up those facilities, but you really need to try to treat that environment as almost a sacred ground, And I would say this about compliance. Understand as an employee in that environment, your ability to embrace and adopt the compliant onboarding is actually really critical, because nothing is as bad as spending time and resources constantly training and onboarding personnel because you're not able to retain them. So your ability to understand the SOPs, use the SOPs, and comply to the SOPs is really valuable to that organization. They want individuals that are comfortable, understand the SOPs, provide inputs to QA, like about improvements on those SOPs. Can't always be implemented. Whenever you have to revise these documents, it takes time and requires signatures. But the reality is, your ability to actually adopt and embrace SOPs and compliance as a culture is actually a very hireable, valuable asset. It's very easy to have an ego in a facility and say it's my way or the highway, or I don't think it should be done this way. But sometimes you also need to accept, this is what the organization needs to achieve its outcomes, and I want to align with that organizational outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Maria, we're coming towards the end, but do you spend more of your time in the processing side, making sure that SOPs are followed, or more on the agricultural side in the cultivation spaces? Where do you find yourself being pulled to and having to bring the stick out more?
Hey, that's a hard one. It's actually both in so many ways, because I need to be on the ground to make sure that these SOPs are being followed according to step by step. And then also, I agree with Gustav and Jeff. We need to let go of our egos, work together, because there's so much potential in this cannabis industry, and everything is new. We all learning. The only thing is to work together, share the information, and then we won't have any failed crops, I think.
Great, thanks for that. So for those of you who don't know, we actually run a commercial cultivation course in Cape Town and Johannesburg. So it's a bit far for some of you from Europe. But we have a 20% discount for any of the courses we're running this year. You just use the code commercial20 at checkout. Linda, if you can just run that on the screen again, just so they can see that code. I think that brings us to the end, guys. I mean, this is, it's a complex, deep topic, but it doesn't have to be scary, and the likes of Cannavigia, who provide software to ultimately make people's lives easier. I think, there's the difference between, those who succeed and those who don't is often attitude. And I think that when people come into this space, they need to understand that, that they can kick and scream as much as they like. But the reality is this is the industry as it is. We are talking about at the moment, especially in this country, cannabis cultivation for medicinal purposes. It might be different in the sort of adult use market when that comes around. But right now, we're cultivating cannabis in this country for export, for medical use, and there are certain parameters we need to fall between. So it's finding that delicate balance between, art and science, and between, not over sanitizing and over complicating and over compliance, which could suffocate and stifle the whole industry. We look at it if you look at it from a regulatory perspective, we do need compliance and systems in place to make sure that we have a regulated framework. But if we over-regulate, we completely suffocate. So I think, as the industry grows and matures, we'll slowly start to find that balance. But I think some fantastic insight, guys. Thank you so much for sharing this. Thank you so much for being here. Wes and the Cannavigia team in Switzerland, thank you so much for sponsoring this series. Just a reminder that we've got a few other coming up. These are the dates. We'll remind you on email when these are coming up. We'll be unpacking all kinds of other interesting, dynamic elements in the industry as we try to bring this industry online and ensure that in South Africa, from a South African perspective, we can drive job creation. We already know we grow good weed, so we just got to pull our socks up and get a little bit more sort of organized, So that's it, guys. Thank you so much. Have a great evening or great morning, wherever you are, might be in the world watching. Thank you guys for all your time, and we'll see you on the next one. Cool.
Thanks,
Ciao.
Jason.
Cool, man. Cheers. Went well.